These monkeys that operate in these hierarchical structures like these Freemasons and what have you, they're signing on to a particular solar view, right? And they worship the people that have been put in front of them, who have been predecessors of this, tradition. So they're getting they're identifying. It's a form of identification, but the identification in their case goes way beyond, and then it's I think it's called I can't remember the term now, but it's known as an emptying out of oneself. They think it's all the rage over in India. You think it's all very holy and all right, but there's other versions of it, and it's the emptying out completely of oneself. And that can't happen until something comes in. You can call that God, or you can, and they have believe me, they actually think it's God. They actually do believe that these archons or whatever they're being possessed by, is a spiritually elevated thing. And that's why you see such an incredible allegiance to it, ideologically and all sorts of ways that they sign on to this kind of stuff, and they want to midwife us into it through their whole post-humanism little agenda. Behind that is an occult agenda and so on. But the simple act of identification. So when somebody like Stuart there was asking, what the hell do we do? What you do is you go out and do the same thing, but you have to identify with something earthy to combat their little Apollonian nightmare. That means, how connected are you? How earthed are you? How grounded are you? We went into this in the last chapter of the Atlantis book. That your salvation is the world, is the earth, is nature. How connected are you to that place? Because that's your weapon, that's your strength. But if you're just sort of not connected, not bolstered, you really are weak in fighting these people. You have to do your own rituals. You have to connect with something. You have to have your totems. You have to have your weapons in place. And I think that that's a very, very key aspect. But remember, I can't tell that person what their totems are. I can't tell. This is where the trick is. Each person, in order to use this will to power, or like I said in posthumanism, get out to nature and do your thing. You see, nobody can create that map for you. Nobody, in fact, that's one of the biggest warnings of all. It's one of the biggest warnings of all. If you want to, somebody even asked a question, I think it was Jeffrey, about Michael, can you define the higher self? Because you talk a lot about the lower self. How can one define the higher self? The higher self is the very thing that we've suppressed the most under all of that parental imagery, right? We live to their image of what they have for us, and then it becomes society. So the most suppressed thing in our life is our own sense of self. But here's the trick. You can never uncover the self unless you do it yourself. It's to and for the self. Nobody else's statement, nobody else's technique has the slightest bearing on a man or a woman discovering their true self. Right? When you take the instructions of other people, it's useless. It immediately applies to the social self, by definition. So the process of discovering the self, which is the secret of defeating evil, because that's where it is, that's where the Aladdin's cave of all the super weapons are, to defeat any evil. Because the man who is centered, evil, he laughs at evil. Right? The man who is so strong, like I said in the last chapter of the Atlantis book, who's so systemically, psychically, and emotionally strong, his enemy can't defeat him by any of their imbecility, their techniques, right? He has won. But you don't conquer the enemy, you don't destroy them. You can't do that because they're handing you the very weapons by which to fight them. So there's only this weird other Zen sort of martial arts technique. And the greatest literature tells you that. I didn't invent that. It's there. The messages for conquering the greatest evil are already written by our forefathers of how to do it. But you don't do it by open war and open conflict. Then they win, because they're actually handing you the techniques. They've actually created those techniques. It's a totally other kind of action. And unfortunately, the human race, we're very far away from understanding the principles of that kind of action. So we do what we can to awaken people to it. And hopefully, they'll sign on for it later on.
Okay, that leads into a question from Facebook, from Sam. What is the true function of the ego in one's journey of self-creation? What is the internal adversary? Is it my ego, the superego, or the self-sadistic, self-hating tendencies?
Okay, there's again top of the line questions there. Who was that? Who asked that?
That was asked by Sam.
Yeah, this is huge. You'll find his answers, by the way, in my Disciples of Mysterium book and my work on that and the post-humanism. It's all there. But again, to answer it in this context, the ego is basically the part of us that's aware of the external world. Like the unconscious is not aware on that level. That's why we call it the unconscious. And remember, it's not about sections of the brain, it's more about a way of seeing. So the inherited way of seeing that we call the unconscious, which is the millions of years of I hate to use the word programming because it's so mechanical sounding, but that's what it basically is. It's nature's programming, organic programming. Then out of that came the ego, which is aware of daily life, right, what we call individual life. And then out of that grew a special part of the ego that used to be called the ego ideal, or super ego. And actually, ego ideal is a better word for it. It's used less, but it's actually a good word because it contains the appropriate word, ideal. It's the ideals that the ego creates in order to move towards to have a tomorrow, to have a future, right? We're future-oriented beings, and it's the superego that is much more conscious about the future than the ego. So ego ideal or superego is so important to know about. Now the first ideals are of the parents. Of course, they're usually rotten ideals, but the kid doesn't know that, right? I mean, you have to choose mommy and daddy as your first ideals, and God help you. But there you are, you're stuck with that, right? And you have uncles and aunts, and then finally, later on, other people external to your life. But to answer Sam's question is that, yes, I think I do subscribe to the post-Freudian concept that the superego is our problem. And I hammered this as much as time allowed in post-humanism. So if he goes back and listens to it, he'll hear me mention the Anna Freuds and the people who worried about the superego. But to break it down, to unpack it, is this. Again, it's worth saying. The superego is nothing more than the conditioning of the parents and the conditioning of the world, right? That impinges upon our sense of self. So the superego is certainly that part of us that is suppressive and oppressive and is responsible for the suppression of the true self that we talked about, that I refer to as the imperial self. If you didn't have the superego, we'd be a lot better off. But you need the superego because all of these parts of consciousness have a meaning, right? They have a purpose. But what has happened is the superego is merely the instrument of the world, of our societies, of our collective, all the voices. This is where it goes wrong, because as society itself becomes more and more pathological, more and more crazy and insane or shallow as it's becoming, then unfortunately the consciousness of the newborn kids is embodied, as you can see all around you, taking place now. So when they say that the parent is responsible, our forefathers are responsible for the state of decay in the world, you're absolutely right, they are, by way of this superego. Now, the way out of it is simple. The ego has more power actually than the superego. The ego itself has more power. It can veto. It can change. You can change. So to all these monkeys' asses who are talking to you about the ego's got to go, I don't know where they ever found this, and I don't care, and I think it's rotten. And you had it in the 60s, and we still got it in the New Age movement, and it's got to go. The ego of anything is the part of you that you're going to rely on. It has many limitations, but so does every other part of consciousness. So you don't cut off your thumbs and say the hand doesn't work. The ego is the part that can veto, can finally get enough strength, ego strength, right? To say, no, I'm not going to live up to these ideals. I'm not going to do what the teachers in the society wants us to do. Which the superego is badgering. It's that voice, it's that punitive voice, prohibitive voice that's nagging at us every time we do something wrong. And I always coax people to listen to his voice, to get familiar with it. That when you think you've done something wrong, or you pulled a little white lie, or you ripped somebody off, or you sort of didn't do right by a friend or whatever, that's a constant nagging voice. Now we need it because it's part of morality. But is true, what Nietzsche and these people ask, is true morality merely the voice of society and the morals and values that society is imposing on you, and your conformity to it is your measure of morality? Or is your morality self-born? Right? And I don't care how many priests exist, how many parents exist, how many rules and regulations. Aleister Crowley sort of ties in a little bit to this, and many other teachers as well. But they were asking this fundamental question. Is your morality organic and coming from within inside yourself by your own set of understandings, your own will? and by the way, if you happen to be attuned to the universe, you will have that will. Or is your concept of morality merely what Big Brother and all its representatives are telling you that you want to? Well, the answer is obvious. Our form of morality is paper thin, which is why it's being broke so many times, why criminality is rampant right now. It's because, yes, these people were right. The kind of pseudo-morality we have is conditioned by religion, conditioned by the society, isn't worth the paper it's written on, and then is breached more and more as society passes, as we go down through history. What needs to take place is a quantum shift where people are being taught, like I talked about children learning discernment, and that people have asked me 3-4 questions about how parents do this and how parents do that. Parents are the bloody problem. I thought I made that clear in post-humanism. The parent is the major problem in the raising of the child because the parent's already contaminated. His spirit, his inner child is already broken from his own parents. How the hell? I don't mean that it can't be done, but that parent has to do a monumental study of his own. And if you do not have a book by Alice Miller in your collection, or Wilhelm Reich, or Alexander Lowen, you ain't doing too good. In fact, where's your Ayn Rand? I can go through a checklist and say, hey parent, what are you reading? And by omission, if you do not have these people's works in your library, you ain't doing too good. What are you reading? Some New Age spinner rack shit? That's not going to help. You've got to go to the masters on this subject. This is huge. This is the real evil. You've brought in a child and exposed them to this crazy, fucked up world, and you think that it's going to do it all on its own? You have a monumental mental responsibility. You signed on for something that you're God in that person's life. But you know what parents are doing? They're turning around and making an instant slave robot the moment that the child appears out of the womb. He's immediately, either a crutch or a slave. Forget anything to do with, and I'm right, aren't I? I mean, look at history. We are in this state because of this constant, neglect. All the literature is there. All the masters are there. All their work is there, telling you about the role of the human body, the role of psychology, the role of the child psychology, right? And we're not listening to it. And we're reaping the whirlwind because of that. So, fighting the Illuminati, is a big thing, the big guns on the hill. No. It starts very, very humbly. It starts very, very humbly inside the self, in the clarification and working with these ego forces to overcome some of the super ego thing, which is nothing more than the representative of society. And as the society gets sicker and sicker, the mind becomes sicker and sicker. Until now, it's so pandemic that even the medical freaks, we know they perpetrate the biggest fraud on earth just by wearing those white coats, but hell, even they have realized they can't deal it with the nice, which is plugging drugs into people. You couldn't even have an army of psychologists. You couldn't even battalions of psychologists. It's impossible. They realize that won't even work. You can't psychoanalyze everyone on earth. There's too many messed up people. So now it's just a matter of just bring out the barrels of bromide, and pharmaceuticals and hope that works. And what's going to turn everyone into is just complete and utter vegetables. And now they've even discovered that some of these drugs aren't working anymore. I foresee that one of the greatest problems in the future is simply disease. Some of the pathogenic, diseases, the bacteria, and all the things that they find it in 50% of American meat now is all becoming immune. Even in England, it's coming a crisis where all the cows, the bacteria, these lethal bacteria in the cows and other livestock is becoming completely immune to all the penicillins and whatever else they're doing. And so now the person whose body, somebody asked about this, somebody whose body is not up, their immunity is very strong even in a physical context, although that's very much linked still to attitudinal immunity, by the way. But unless that is, taken on board, and questions of diet, and questions of meat eating and all of these things are brought to the table now, well, we may be in a very, very, very sad state, because the moment that the body is weakened, then the mind is weakened, and then Big Brother wins again. So there's new genocides on their way. There was genocides after the First and Second World War with the Spanish flu, the introduction of beer, more of the fluoride into the water, which then affected the beer, so people who drank incessantly after the wars, the men became very docile and weak. I've gone into this stuff. But now there's going to be even more versions of this through all of these weird drugs. And I've got a lot of information out on the forum so people can check it out, especially on the post-humanism page.
Thank you for that, Michael.